that this was happening?
No, I was aware of it last night, but not from the administration. I chose not to divulge what I knew because I didn't want to endanger Mr. Gross's release. Obviously, there's a human element to it. I was briefed this morning at around 10 a.m. by Secretary Kerry, but I had already known about many of these changes. And quite frankly, I was expecting them. For weeks, I've been asking Tony Blinken, who has now been confirmed by the Senate, specifically about these topics, and his answers, nebulous at best, really led me to believe that something was in the works. And I think, of course, it's par for the course for this administration to announce it the day that Congress finally recesses. I think that was not by accident either.
Senator, I do want to ask you one question about your opinion about policy toward Cuba, because you seem to say to me two things that are a little bit of an opposition. You say that the embargo and sanctions in our measures towards Cuba, they haven't worked because everyone else has been trading with Cuba all along, but then you say it's leverage in how we deal with Cuba in the future. Can you have both things at once? Can you have it be leverage and can you have it not working at the same time?
Well, I think you misunderstood my first point. My first point was people often say the Cuban embargo is hurting the Cuban people. And my answer is that's absurd. The Cuban people can theoretically buy products from any nation on earth. The reason they don't have those products is not because of the Cuban embargo, it's because of their government is incompetent. Now, the U.S. embargo is leverage because Cuba cares. I mean, we're the United States. You know, we're not some small country halfway around the world. We're the most powerful and important country on the planet. We're their closest neighbor geographically. They care deeply. Their number one priority of the Cuban government is to affect U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba. And you see this consistently reflected in the people they try to influence in academia, and the editorials that have now been a steady stream of editorials in the New York Times, and the folks that are walking around the Capitol here, and the colleagues of mine that are constantly being reached out to by the regime to try to get them on their side for these changes. There's a reason for that. They know that if they can open up U.S. markets to their regime, they will have American companies invested in the status quo in Cuba. And what you're going to have now is American companies doing business in Cuba advocating here for us not to do anything to disrupt the status quo because it's good for their bottom line. And I know that to be true because last week we passed a bill here that supported the democratic aspirations of people in Hong Kong, and my office got multiple calls from companies that do business in China asking us not to do it because they have an interest in the status quo. The same was true with Ukrainian sanctions and people that have business deals with Moscow. They want us not to do too much on the sanctions front. Now you're going to see that with Cuba as well.
You've obviously been on the phone and you've been hearing from folks in your state, leaders there, people from the Cuban American community. What are you hearing from folks?
Well, look, I mean, among many of the exiles, there's a resistance to any sort of change whatsoever in policy that would share many of the concerns I've just outlined. There are people in the Cuban community who share our goals of bringing about democracy, and they believe that if somehow there was more economic trade with Cuba, that would somehow create the conditions for an uprising or a dramatic change. I just don't know where that's ever happened. When has tourism ever brought about democracy? This government controls every aspect of life in Cuba, every aspect of life. Every single policy change that the U.S. has ever made towards Cuba, whether it's more travel, more person-to-person contact, more remittances, they have manipulated every single one of them. And they will manipulate this as well. This is a small island of 13 million people with an apparatus that's been in place for over 50 years. It controls every aspect of life in Cuba, and it will control this as well. They will use all of these changes to their advantage. They will never allow any of these changes to undermine their grip on the island.
Senator,